Silas Caldwell didn't lower his voice when he said it. "Let's be honest, she's leaving with nothing. That's generous considering she came in penniless." The conference room remained silent, polished wood reflecting the weight of his words. Attorneys, assistants, witnesses, no one intervened. Iliana Marchand signed her name without hesitation. Her phone vibrated once beside her hand. An unread email. Subject line: "Final asset transfer completed." No one in that room noticed it. And no one, not even Silas, understood what had just changed. If you believe dignity doesn't always speak the loudest but endures the longest, stay with this story. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if stories about quiet strength and justice matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what unfolds next. Iliana Marchand had always understood the value of silence, not as submission but as a form of control. Long before her name ever appeared on legal documents tied to wealth and consequence, before conference rooms and polished signatures, she spent her days among shelves of case reporters and annotated statutes inside a quiet legal library, tucked between two aging buildings in Lower Manhattan. It was the kind of place most people overlooked. Iliana preferred it that way. She worked as a legal research assistant, though the title rarely captured what she actually did. She traced arguments backward. She noticed inconsistencies others skipped. She remembered footnotes. While attorneys rushed toward conclusions, Iliana moved differently, methodical, patient, almost invisible. And always, she wrote things down. Not casually, not as reminders, as records. A slim black notebook stayed with her at all times. Dates, phrases, tone. Who said what, and how they said it. Patterns mattered to her more than isolated incidents. Patterns revealed intent. That habit didn't begin in New York. It began years earlier in a quieter place with a man few people outside certain circles ever spoke about publicly. Iliana Marchand. To Iliana, he had never been the founder of anything. He was simply the man who taught her that attention was a form of power. "People tell you who they are," he once said, pouring tea with deliberate precision. "Not all at once, and rarely in ways they intend." Iliana had listened. She always listened. But Iliana Marchand was not a constant presence in her life. He existed on the edges of it, letters that arrived without warning. Brief visits that felt structured rather than emotional. He never explained the scope of his work, and Iliana never asked. What he offered instead were habits: observe, record, wait. After he passed out of her day-to-day life, those habits remained. They shaped everything, including her marriage. She met Silas Caldwell in a setting that in hindsight felt almost predictable, an event hosted by a mid-sized corporate law firm celebrating a successful merger. Iliana had been invited by a senior librarian who occasionally worked with litigation teams. She attended out of courtesy, not expectation. Silas noticed her before she noticed him. Not because she stood out, but because she didn't try to. While others circulated with calculated enthusiasm, Iliana remained near the edge of the room, listening more than speaking. When she did speak, it was precise, economical. She didn't fill silence unnecessarily. Silas found that unusual. At the time, he was building momentum in his career, sharp, articulate, already known among his peers for closing deals that required both aggression and polish. He understood performance. He understood presence. Iliana offered neither, and that to him felt like something to acquire. Their first conversation was brief. He asked what she did. She answered simply, "I work in legal research." He smiled, as if the answer confirmed something. "That sounds quiet." "It is," she said. Silas interpreted that as modesty. It wasn't. In the beginning, he treated her with a kind of attentiveness that felt to an outside observer like respect. He opened doors. He introduced her to colleagues. He spoke about her in ways that suggested admiration, though often framed in contrast to his own world. "She keeps me grounded," he once told a partner. Iliana heard that. She wrote it down later. Grounded. At first, the difference between them seemed balanced. Silas moved quickly. Iliana did not. He spoke in rooms. She listened in them. Where he sought recognition, she avoided it. But over time, the balance shifted. Not suddenly. Gradually. It began with small corrections. At dinners, if Iliana offered an observation, something factual, often accurate, Silas would rephrase it moments later, adjusting tone, simplifying language, making it more palatable for the room. "She means," he would say, smiling, "that it's complicated." The first time it happened, Iliana said nothing. The second time, she noticed the pattern. By the third, she had already begun recording it. Date, location, phrase. She didn't confront him. There was no argument. Because to Iliana, the moment itself wasn't the issue. The repetition was. Silas, meanwhile, never considered his behavior unusual. In his mind, he was refining communication, managing impressions, protecting both of them in a way that aligned with how he understood success. He began to speak for her more often, not aggressively, casually. At gatherings, when someone directed a question toward Iliana, Silas would answer first lightly as if assisting. "She's not really into all that," he might say. Or, "She prefers to keep things simple." Iliana would remain still, her expression unchanged. But later in the quiet of their apartment, she would open her notebook and write. The apartment itself reflected Silas's taste more than hers. Clean lines, expensive finishes, art chosen for its perceived value rather than meaning. Iliana had contributed little to its design, not because she lacked preference, but because she recognized early that preference in that space required negotiation, and negotiation required energy. She conserved hers. There were moments still when Silas appeared attentive. He would bring her coffee in the mornings, ask about her day. But even those gestures carried a subtle framing questions that assumed simplicity answers that he anticipated before she gave them. "How was the library?" he'd ask, already reaching for his phone. "Quiet," she would reply. He would nod as if that confirmed something again. What Silas never understood was that Iliana's silence was not emptiness. It was accumulation. Every overlooked comment, every redirected conversation, every assumption made in her presence but not with her participation, it all settled somewhere specific, ordered, indexed, waiting. There were evenings when they attended firm events together, rooms filled with partners, clients, and the quiet competition that defined those spaces. Iliana moved through them without friction, offering polite responses when addressed, never extending herself beyond what was necessary. To some, she seemed reserved. To others, unremarkable. To Silas, increasingly, she became background. Not in a way he would have articulated directly, but in how he introduced her. "This is Iliana," he would say without elaboration. Once, someone asked what she specialized in. Silas answered before she could. "She keeps things organized," he said lightly. Iliana met the person's gaze, then nodded. She didn't correct him. That night, she added a longer entry to her notebook. Not just what was said, but who was present, who reacted, who didn't. Patterns required context. Context required detail. Weeks passed, then months. Silas's career advanced. New clients, larger deals, longer hours. And with that growth came a shift in how he measured value. Time became currency. Visibility became proof. And anything that didn't directly contribute to those metrics began in his mind to diminish. Iliana felt that shift before he ever expressed it. It showed in smaller things first. Decisions made without her input. Plans communicated rather than discussed. A tone subtle but consistent that suggested her role was adjacent, not equal. Still, she didn't confront him. Because Iliana was not collecting moments to argue. She was collecting them to understand. One evening, while organizing documents at the library after closing hours, she paused over a case file involving financial misconduct. Nothing extraordinary, but detailed in its unraveling. Emails, transactions, timelines, evidence assembled slowly until it became undeniable. Iliana closed the file and sat for a moment longer than necessary. Then she reached for her notebook. Not to write something new, but to review. Pages filled with observations, not emotional, not reactive, just precise accounts of behavior over time. A pattern doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself. And Iliana, without ever raising her voice, had already begun to see the full shape of it. Silas had not. Not yet. Control, when introduced carefully, rarely looks like control at all. In the early months of their marriage, Silas Caldwell never used the word restriction. He didn't need to. His methods were quieter, shaped in ways that felt, at least on the surface, practical. "Let me handle the accounts," he said one evening. standing near the kitchen island, sleeves rolled, voice calm. It's just easier. I already manage complex portfolios at work. No reason to complicate things at home. Iliana had looked at him for a moment, not searching for reassurance but for structure. All right, she said. She did not ask for access later. She simply noted the moment. At first, the arrangement seemed efficient. Bills were paid on time. Statements never cluttered the apartment. Financial decisions, investments, subscriptions, even charitable donations were made without disruption. But efficiency, Iliana understood, often concealed ownership. Weeks passed before she realized she no longer had visibility into anything beyond immediate expenses. Her debit card worked, but it was linked to a secondary account, one that received limited transfers irregularly timed. She never questioned the amount. She questioned the pattern. In her notebook, the entries became more structured. Dates aligned with transfers. Transfers aligned with events. Events aligned with Silas's mood, his workload, his presence or absence at home. The pattern was not random. It was responsive. Silas, for his part, did not consider this control. He considered it management. At work, he operated within systems where clarity came from hierarchy. Someone led, others followed. Decisions flowed downward. Accountability flowed upward. He applied the same model unconsciously to his marriage. Iliana did not resist. Resistance, she knew, would alter the pattern, and she needed the pattern intact. Their social life expanded alongside Silas's career. Invitations arrived more frequently, dinners at private clubs, networking events, firm celebrations, where success was measured not only in results, but in presentation. Iliana attended most of them. Not out of obligation, out of observation. At these gatherings, roles were often assigned before introductions were completed. Silas was the rising attorney, the one to watch. Confident, articulate, strategic. Iliana was present. That was enough for most. Conversations moved around her rather than through her. When addressed, she responded with precision, offering insights that were often sharper than expected. But those moments rarely lingered. Silas had a way of redirecting, subtly. Iliana prefers the academic side of things, he would say with a light smile. She leaves the negotiations to me. There was always a tone, pleasant, controlled, that suggested agreement. Iliana never corrected him. Not because she agreed, but because correction in those rooms would shift attention from observation to conflict. And conflict closed doors. Instead, she watched. One evening stood out more than others. A private dinner hosted by one of Silas's senior partners, Charles Whitmore, a man whose reputation carried weight across multiple firms. The setting was deliberate, low lighting, curated guest list conversations designed to signal alignment. Iliana sat to Silas's right across from a venture capitalist named Lauren Pierce. The discussion turned gradually toward regulatory frameworks, recent changes that affected cross-border transactions. Lauren made a broad statement, technically correct but incomplete. Iliana spoke quietly. There's an exception in subsection 14C that complicates that interpretation, she said. It hasn't been widely applied yet, but it changes enforcement thresholds. The table paused. Lauren blinked, considering. Before she could respond, Silas leaned in, smiling. What Iliana means, he said smoothly, is that the rules are still evolving. Nothing to act on just yet. The moment shifted. Conversation moved on. Iliana did not speak again for the remainder of the evening. But later in the quiet of their apartment, she wrote for nearly 20 minutes. Not just the exchange, the reaction, the timing. Who noticed? Who didn't? Silas entered the room halfway through, loosening his tie. You didn't have to get into that, he said, not unkindly. These conversations are more about positioning than precision. Iliana looked up briefly. I understand. He nodded, satisfied. He believed the matter settled. But Iliana added one more line to her entry after he left the room. Positioning over precision. The phrase stayed with her. It explained more than he intended. Days blended into weeks and the pattern deepened. Silas began making larger financial decisions without mention. Investments, reallocations, commitments tied to his firm's clients. The scale increased, but the communication did not. Iliana became aware of these decisions indirectly through passing comments, through documents left briefly unattended, through changes in lifestyle that appeared without discussion. A new membership at a private club, a shift in their insurance coverage, a conversation about tax implications that assumed knowledge she had never been given. She didn't ask. She recorded. Her notebook grew heavier, not in weight but in density. Each entry connected to another. Threads formed. Timelines extended. It was no longer a collection of moments. It was a structure. One afternoon, while organizing archived materials at the library, Iliana came across a misplaced envelope unrelated to her work, likely left behind by a visiting attorney. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The name on the corner was enough. Caldwell and Pierce LLP. Silas's firm. She set it aside, intending to return it. But the coincidence aligned with something she had noted earlier, a conversation Silas had mentioned in passing about a joint venture, a fund structure that required discretion. That night, when Silas returned home, he seemed focused. Not distracted. Focused. There was a difference. "How was your day?" he asked, placing his keys down without looking at her. "Productive," Iliana replied. He nodded, already moving on. "I might be tied up for the next few weeks. Big deal coming through. High stakes." Iliana watched him for a moment. "Anything I should know?" she asked. It was a simple question. Open. Neutral. Silas paused just briefly. Then he smiled. "Not really. It's complicated." The same phrase. Again. Iliana inclined her head slightly. "All right." She did not press further. Later, when he was asleep, she sat at the small desk near the window and opened her notebook. The entries from that day connected to several before it. Caldwell and Pierce. Lauren Pierce. The dinner. The conversation about regulatory exceptions. The timing of recent financial movements. Individually, each detail was insignificant. Together, they formed a direction. Iliana did not jump to conclusions. She never did. Instead, she marked the page with a small symbol. She rarely used one that indicated a developing pattern not yet complete. Then she closed the notebook. Across the room, Silas slept without interruption, unaware that the structure he believed he controlled was being observed quietly, precisely, by someone he had already begun to underestimate. And somewhere in Iliana's inbox, the unread email from Marchand Holdings remained untouched, waiting. News, when it arrived for Iliana Marchand, rarely came with urgency. It came with precision. The call reached her in the late afternoon, just as the legal library began its slow transition into evening quiet. The overhead lights dimmed slightly, casting longer shadows across rows of case reporters. Iliana was at her desk reviewing an appellate brief when her phone vibrated once, then again. Unknown number. She let it ring twice more before answering. Iliana Marchand speaking. The voice on the other end was measured, practiced. Male, mid-aged. "Miss Marchand, my name is Robert Klein. I'm calling from Harrington and Blythe, LLP. I'm afraid I'm contacting you regarding a matter of some urgency." Iliana did not interrupt. "We represent the estate of Iliana Marchand." A pause. Subtle. Intentional. "We regret to inform you that Mr. Marchand passed away 3 days ago." Silence followed, not the kind that asked for comfort, but the kind that allowed information to settle. Iliana closed the file in front of her. "I understand," she said. There was no immediate shift in her tone, no visible reaction that could be measured from the other end of the line. Robert Klein continued. "Your name appears in several documents that require your attention. There are estate matters that cannot proceed without your direct involvement. We would like to schedule a meeting at your earliest convenience." Iliana glanced at the clock. "What is the nature of these matters?" Another pause, shorter this time. "I believe it would be best discussed in person." "Of course," she thought. "All right," Iliana replied. "Send me the details." The call ended within seconds. No condolences, no elaboration, just direction. Iliana sat still for a moment, longer than necessary, her hand resting lightly against the closed file. Iliana Marchand. The name existed in her memory not as a figure of public significance, but as a presence defined by distance and discipline. He had never spoken about his work in specifics, never explained the structure of his life beyond what was immediately relevant. What he had offered her instead were fragments, habits, observations, and an insistence, quiet but consistent, that understanding required patience. Iliana reached for her notebook. She did not write immediately. Instead, she opened to a blank page and placed the pen at the top. waiting not for emotion but for clarity. Then, in precise handwriting, date, time. Caller Robert Klein Harrington and Blythe LLP. Subject estate of Iliana Marchand. She paused, then added urgency indicated. Details withheld pending meeting. The pen lifted. She closed the notebook. Iliana did not leave work early that day. She completed her tasks as scheduled, returned materials to their proper places, and shut down her desk with the same care she applied every evening. Only after stepping outside into the cooler air of early evening did she allow herself to consider the broader implication. Iliana Marchand was not a man associated with small matters. Even without knowing specifics, Iliana understood that much. The email arrived before she reached home. From Harrington and Blythe LLP, subject estate consultation. Iliana Marchand. Inside a formal invitation. Date, time. Address Midtown Manhattan upper floors, a building known for housing firms that did not advertise. She read it once. Then again, then archived it without response. At home, Silas was already there. Unusual. He stood near the kitchen counter, reviewing something on his tablet. His posture suggested focus, but not tension. When he noticed her, he offered a brief smile. "You're back early." "I finished on time," Iliana said, setting her bag down. He nodded, returning his attention to the screen. "Dinner's in the fridge." "I had to take a call." Iliana moved through the apartment quietly, her movements efficient, familiar. She reheated the food, sat at the table, and ate without distraction. Silas spoke intermittently, comments about work, about a potential deal moving forward, about a colleague who had made a mistake that would likely cost him. Iliana listened. She always listened. But tonight her attention divided not between him and something else, but between what was said and what had not yet been revealed. "Busy tomorrow?" Silas asked casually. "Yes." "What kind of busy?" "A meeting." "With who?" Iliana looked up briefly. "A law firm." Silas's expression shifted, not suspicious but curious. "Something I'd know." "I don't think so." He considered that for a moment, then shrugged. "All right." The conversation ended there. He did not ask further. Not because he wasn't interested, but because in his mind there was nothing in Iliana's world that required his involvement. That assumption, Iliana noted internally, had become consistent. Later that night, after Silas had gone to sleep, Iliana sat near the window again, the city lights stretching beyond the glass in quiet repetition. She opened her laptop. Not to respond to the email. To search. Marchand Global Holdings. The results appeared quickly. Articles. Financial summaries. Corporate structures layered across jurisdictions. Subsidiaries connected to industries ranging from logistics to energy to private equity. The scale was not immediately graspable, but the presence was undeniable. Iliana did not react outwardly. She read, carefully, tracing names, dates, transactions, patterns, the same way she always did. Iliana Marchand's name appeared repeatedly but rarely in recent years. The company had transitioned into a structure managed by boards, executives, legal teams that operated with autonomy. But ultimate ownership, remained tied to the estate. Iliana closed the laptop after an hour, not because she had finished, because she had seen enough to understand that this was not a simple matter. The next morning she arrived at Harrington and Blythe 15 minutes early. The building itself was understated, no signage beyond a small brass plate near the entrance. Inside, everything was deliberate. Clean lines, neutral tones. Silence that felt constructed rather than incidental. She gave her name at the front desk. They were expecting her. Of course they were. Robert Klein met her in the reception area. He was exactly as his voice suggested, composed, efficient, careful with his expressions. "Miss Marchand," he said, extending a hand. Iliana shook at once. "Thank you for coming." He led her through a series of corridors into a conference room that overlooked the city. No unnecessary decoration, only what was required. They sat. A folder was placed in front of her. Thick, structured. "Before we proceed," Robert said, "there are formalities we need to address. Verification primarily." Iliana nodded. He continued. "As you may already be aware, Iliana Marchand was the founder of Marchand Global Holdings. Upon his passing, the estate entered a transitional phase. Your name appears as the primary beneficiary in several controlling documents." He paused, not for effect but for confirmation. Iliana did not speak. Robert studied her briefly as if measuring her reaction. There was none. He opened the folder. Inside, documents, certifications, legal language that extended across pages. However, he continued, the transfer of assets, particularly at this scale, requires a structured process. Verification of identity, review of holdings, regulatory compliance across multiple jurisdictions. Iliana glanced down at the documents, not overwhelmed, focused. How long? She asked. Several weeks, Robert replied. Possibly longer depending on external factors. Iliana nodded once. And during that time, you will be advised not to disclose this information publicly, or privately where possible. Premature disclosure could complicate proceedings. Iliana closed the folder gently. I understand. Robert leaned back slightly. There will be a team assigned to assist you. Legal, financial, administrative. We'll coordinate everything. Iliana's gaze returned to him. I prefer to review everything personally. A brief pause. Then Robert nodded. Of course. The meeting continued for over an hour. Details layered upon details. Structures explained without simplification. Responsibilities outlined without assumption. Iliana asked few questions, but when she did, they were precise. Targeted. Not about what something was, but how it functioned. By the time she left the building, the city had shifted into midday rhythm, faster, louder, less contained. Iliana stepped onto the sidewalk and paused briefly. Not to process. To note. Everything had changed. Nothing had been revealed. And for now, that was exactly how it needed to remain. Silas Caldwell did not initiate the divorce with anger. He initiated it with clarity. By the time he brought it up, the decision had already been made, evaluated, structured, and in his mind, justified. It happened on a Tuesday evening. No raised voices, no visible tension. Just a shift in tone so slight that to anyone unfamiliar with him it might have gone unnoticed. Iliana was at the dining table reviewing a stack of documents from Harrington and Blythe. Not the full estate files, those remained secured, but summaries, timelines, procedural outlines. She had begun mapping them, mentally aligning each requirement with the necessary sequence. Silas entered, placed his briefcase down, and loosened his tie. We should talk, he said. Iliana closed the folder in front of her. All right. He remained standing for a moment as if deciding how much explanation was required. I've been thinking about where things are going, he began. Long term. Iliana waited. Silas moved toward the kitchen counter, resting his hands lightly against the surface. I need a different kind of structure, he continued. Professionally, personally, something that aligns better with where I'm headed. The phrasing was careful, abstract enough to avoid confrontation, specific enough to imply conclusion. Iliana's expression did not change. And what does that mean, she asked. Silas exhaled once, not heavily, but with a sense of finality. It means I think it's best if we separate. The word hung between them. Separate. Not emotional. Not reactive. Administrative. Iliana considered it not as a statement to accept or reject, but as information to place within an existing pattern. How long have you decided this? She asked. Silas hesitated just briefly. A while. She nodded. That aligned. There had been signs, shifts in schedule, changes in tone, and increasing distance that was not physical but structural. I've already spoken with counsel, he added, just to understand the process. Of course you have, Iliana thought. Aloud, she said. Who Victor Hale, Silas replied. He handles corporate transitions. Very efficient. Iliana knew the name. Not personally, but through references, cases, outcomes. All right, she said. Silas seemed to relax slightly as if her lack of resistance confirmed his expectation. I want this to be straightforward, he continued. No complications. Clean separation. Iliana folded her hands together on the table. What does that look like, she asked. Silas walked over and retrieved a thin folder from his briefcase. He placed it on the table, sliding it toward her. I've had a draft prepared, just a starting point. Iliana opened it. The document was structured with precision sections, clearly defined language, formal terms outlined without ambiguity. Division of assets, spousal support, property. Each section concluded quickly, because there was little to divide. Silas had ensured that. Most assets were held in his name. Accounts consolidated. Investments structured through entities Iliana had no access to. The result was simple. Iliana would leave with nothing. No claim. No continuation. A clean exit. She read each page without interruption. Silas watched her not closely but with enough attention to gauge reaction. There was none. No tightening of expression. No hesitation. Just movement page to page. You'll notice, he said, that I've tried to make this as fair as possible given the circumstances. Iliana reached the final page. What circumstances? She asked. Silas tilted his head slightly as if the answer were self-evident. You didn't bring financial assets into the marriage, he said. And your current work, well, it doesn't really intersect with this level. There it was. Not said harshly, but said clearly. Iliana closed the document. And the timeline, she asked. Soon, Silas replied. The sooner we finalize, the easier it is for both of us. Of course. There were reasons for urgency. Iliana had already begun to see them, though not fully. All right, she said. Silas blinked once. That's it, he asked. Iliana looked at him. You've already decided, she said. There's nothing to negotiate. He studied her for a moment, perhaps expecting something else, resistance, emotion, a question that required defense. But Iliana offered none. After a brief pause, he nodded. I'll have Victor send over the final version, he said. We can schedule the signing later this week. Iliana inclined her head slightly. Let me know when. The conversation ended there. Not abruptly. Simply concluded. That night, Silas worked late in the study. Calls. Emails. Movement that suggested forward motion toward something he had already aligned himself with. Iliana remained at the table long after he left the room, the document still in front of her. She opened her notebook. New entry. Date. Time. Subject. Divorce initiation. Silas Caldwell. She recorded the conversation word for word as closely as memory allowed. Not just content, but tone. Timing. Pauses. Then she turned to a fresh page and began listing. Accounts she knew of. Transactions she had observed. References Silas had made in passing. Names. Firms. Structures. She was not guessing. She was reconstructing. Over the past months, years, even Iliana had accumulated fragments. Pieces of information that individually held little significance. Now they aligned. Patterns required context. And context she now had. The next morning, while Silas was out, Iliana moved through the apartment with quiet efficiency. She did not search randomly. She knew where to look. The study. A drawer not locked because it didn't need to be. Inside documents. Statements. Printouts that had been reviewed and set aside. Iliana did not take anything. She photographed. Page by page. Careful. Systematic. Bank records. Transaction summaries. Internal memos with firm letterhead. Names appeared, some familiar from her notes, others new, but all connected. She returned everything exactly as she found it. No disruption, no trace. Back at the table, she transferred the images to her laptop. Encrypted folder. Organized by date. Cross-referenced with her notebook. The structure expanded, not complete, but no longer abstract. Later that afternoon, she met with Eleanor Vance. The meeting had been scheduled days earlier under the pretense of a state consultation. But Iliana had adjusted its purpose. Eleanor's office was understated, much like Harrington and Blythe, but with a different energy, less formal, more strategic. You mentioned there might be additional matters, Eleanor said once they were seated. Iliana placed a slim folder on the table. I need these reviewed, she said. Eleanor opened it. Inside, printed summaries of selected documents Iliana had captured. Not everything, just enough. Eleanor's eyes moved quickly across the pages, her expression shifting not dramatically but perceptibly. Where did you get this? She asked. My husband's files, Iliana replied. Eleanor looked up. Does he know you have them? No? A pause. Longer this time. These transactions, Eleanor said slowly, they suggest irregularities. Iliana did not respond. Eleanor closed the folder. You're in the middle of a divorce, she said, and you're about to inherit a significant estate. Iliana nodded once. Eleanor leaned back. Timing matters, she continued. If this is handled incorrectly, it could complicate both processes. I'm not acting yet, Iliana said. Eleanor studied her. Good, she replied, because if we move forward, it needs to be precise. Iliana's gaze remained steady. That's why I brought it to you. Eleanor tapped the folder lightly. I'll review everything in detail, she said, quietly. Iliana stood. Thank you. As she left the office, the city moved around her as it always did, unaware, uninterrupted. But within the structure, Iliana had been building patiently, silently. The pieces were no longer isolated. They were connected. And for the first time, the pattern was beginning to reveal not just behavior, but consequence. Change in Iliana Marchand's world did not arrive as a surge of emotion or a moment of revelation. It arrived as a quiet recalibration, something structural, almost mathematical, where each new piece of information adjusted the weight of everything that came before it. In the days following her meeting with Eleanor Vance, nothing outwardly shifted in a way that anyone, especially Silas, would notice. Iliana still woke at the same hour, still dressed with the same understated precision, still moved through the legal library with the same quiet presence that made her easy to overlook. She processed requests, retrieved volumes, annotated references, and returned everything to its place with care that bordered on ritual. But internally something had changed, not in pace, in scale, because for the first time the patterns she had been documenting were no longer confined to the boundaries of a marriage. They now intersected with something far larger, an institutional structure that extended beyond individuals, beyond rooms, beyond anything Silas believed himself to control. Eleanor's message had come late the previous evening. Brief, direct, unnecessary words removed. Can you come in tomorrow morning? Early. Iliana did not ask why. She understood that urgency when expressed by someone like Eleanor was not emotional, it was procedural. The next morning, the city had not yet fully awakened when Iliana stepped into the building that housed Eleanor's office. The lobby lights were softer, the usual current of movement replaced by a stillness that felt temporary, as though the day had not yet decided what it would become. Eleanor was already waiting. There was no preamble, no polite transition, only a table, and on it a series of documents arranged with deliberate care, each tabbed cross-referenced, marked in a way that suggested not just review, but interpretation. Sit, Eleanor said. Iliana did. For a brief moment, Eleanor did not speak. She studied Iliana instead, not searching for reaction, but assessing readiness. What she saw seemed to confirm whatever she had anticipated. I've completed an initial consolidation, Eleanor began, her voice even controlled. Not a full audit. That will take time, but enough to establish structure. She turned the first document toward Iliana. This, she said, is what Iliana Marchand left behind. Iliana's eyes moved across the page, not scanning but reading with the same deliberate attention she applied to everything. The document did not simplify itself for comprehension. It was dense, layered with legal language, jurisdictional distinctions, and references to entities that existed within other entities, each serving a function that was not immediately visible without context. But Iliana did not need simplification. She needed orientation. Marchand Global Holdings, Eleanor continued, is not a single entity. It is a network constructed over decades to operate across multiple regulatory environments. Energy logistics, private equity infrastructure, each sector compartmentalized but ultimately connected. She paused, allowing Iliana time not to process but to position the information. At the top of that structure, Eleanor said, tapping the page lightly, is the controlling interest. Iliana's gaze followed the line. Her name appeared there. Not as a mention, as a designation. Primary beneficiary, controlling stake. The words were exact. They did not imply. They defined. Iliana did not react outwardly, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, as if her center of gravity had adjusted in response to a new understanding. What is the valuation? She asked. Eleanor did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached for another document, one that summarized the financial scope in broader terms, though even that summary required a level of familiarity most would not possess. Conservatively, Eleanor said approximately $30 billion. The number settled into the space between them without distortion. Iliana did not lean back, did not inhale sharply. She simply absorbed it the way she absorbed everything else, by placing it within a framework. Not what it meant emotionally, but what it meant structurally. "And the transfer?" Iliana asked. "In progress," Eleanor replied. "Some components have already been executed. Others require verification, regulatory compliance, identity confirmation, jurisdictional clearance. It's a controlled sequence." "How long?" "Several weeks," Eleanor said. "Possibly longer depending on external review." Iliana nodded once. "And until then, you remain undisclosed," Eleanor said. "Your name does not appear publicly. Control exists in process, not yet in execution." Iliana understood the distinction. Power before recognition was fragile. "And disclosure?" Iliana asked. "Should be avoided," Eleanor replied. "Premature visibility creates variables we cannot control." Iliana closed the document gently. That aligned with everything she had already practiced. Observe. Record. Wait. Eleanor watched her for a moment, then reached for a second folder. "This is the part that concerns your husband," she said. The tone did not change, but the focus did. Iliana's attention shifted accordingly. Eleanor opened the folder, revealing a series of documents Iliana recognized, not individually but in structure. Bank records, transaction summaries, internal communications. The fragments she had collected, now arranged. "Your documentation," Eleanor said, "is precise." Iliana said nothing. "It shows pattern," Eleanor continued. "Not isolated activity, but repeated behavior across time." She turned a page. "These transactions move through intermediary entities' shell structures, layered accounts. On the surface, they comply with reporting requirements. But the timing, the sequencing, suggests coordination." With what Iliana asked, Eleanor met her gaze. With the need to obscure origin, the room remained still. "Illegality?" Iliana asked. Eleanor chose her words carefully. "Not conclusively," she said. "Not yet. But enough to raise regulatory concern." She tapped another section. "What makes this relevant to you," she added, "is the intersection." Iliana's gaze lowered. "Several of these entities," Eleanor explained, "are indirectly connected to investment channels within the Marchand structure. Not controlled by it, but adjacent. Close enough that any investigation could draw attention in that direction." Iliana understood immediately. Not as a threat. As a variable. "Is it actionable?" she asked. Eleanor leaned back slightly, considering. "Yes," she said. "But not immediately." "Why? Because timing," Eleanor replied, "is the difference between exposure and leverage." The distinction was precise. "If we act now," she continued, "before your inheritance is fully secured, we risk entangling both processes. That could delay your control or worse, fragment it." Iliana absorbed that. "So we wait," she said. Eleanor nodded. "We continue building the case," she added. "Quietly, thoroughly. When the moment comes, the structure needs to be complete." Iliana's eyes returned to the documents. "I have more," she said. Eleanor's expression shifted slightly, not surprised but attentive. "How much more?" "Enough to establish continuity," Iliana replied. A pause followed, long enough to acknowledge the weight of that statement. Then Eleanor closed the folder. "Then we proceed," she said. "Not as a suggestion, as a decision." In the days that followed, Iliana's life did not become louder. It became more precise. Her movements remained consistent to anyone observing from the outside. She still returned home at the same hour, still spoke to Silas in the same measured tone, still occupied space, without drawing attention. But beneath that consistency, she adjusted. Meetings were scheduled carefully, sparsely, each one justified by reasons that required no further explanation. Time was allocated not in blocks but in layers, each task serving more than one purpose. She met with financial analysts who spoke in risk matrices and regulatory thresholds, with compliance specialists who understood how systems failed and how they were protected from failing publicly. Iliana did not ask what would happen. She asked how. How is this tracked? What triggers review? What level of documentation is considered sufficient? Each answer became part of a larger structure she was assembling, not physically but cognitively. At home, Silas remained unchanged, or rather he continued in the direction he had already chosen. His focus narrowed toward his deal. Whatever it was, it demanded more of him, and in demanding more, it revealed more. Not through confession. through pattern, late calls, shortened explanations, references to urgency framed as opportunity. It's going to shift everything, he said one evening, pacing slightly as he spoke. Iliana looked up briefly. Everything, she asked. Silas smiled faintly. You'll see. She did not respond. Because she already had. That night, Iliana sat by the window, her notebook open, the city stretching out beneath her in quiet repetition. The pages had changed. What once held observations now held connections, lines drawn between names, symbols marking intersections, timelines extending across months, aligning with events that at the time had seemed unremarkable. On one page she had drawn a structure. At one end, Silas Caldwell. At the other, Marchand Holdings. Between them, a network partial, incomplete, but no longer abstract. Iliana rested her pen against the paper, not writing, not moving, simply observing what she had already built. She did not need to act yet, because for the first time she was no longer only documenting a pattern. She was beginning to understand its outcome, and that more than anything required patience. The morning of the signing did not arrive with tension. It arrived with order. Iliana Marchand woke at the same hour. The light outside her window was still muted, the edges of buildings softened by a pale gray that belonged neither to night nor to day. She moved through her routine without variation, shower, coffee, a brief glance through her notes, not to review but to align. Nothing about the day required improvisation. Everything had already been set into motion. Silas, by contrast, was already awake when she stepped into the kitchen. He stood near the counter, dressed earlier than usual, his posture carrying a quiet urgency he did not attempt to conceal. His phone rested beside him, screen lighting intermittently with messages he read but did not respond to immediately. Big day, he said without looking up. Iliana poured her coffee. Yes. Silas glanced at her, then studying her briefly, not with suspicion but with a kind of detached curiosity, as if confirming something he had already decided. You're all right with everything? He asked. The question was not an invitation. It was a formality. Iliana met his gaze. Yes. Silas nodded, once satisfied. The simplicity of her answer aligned with his expectations. No complication. No delay. That makes things easier, he said. Iliana did not respond, because ease, she understood, was rarely neutral. It was usually designed. They left the apartment together but did not travel as a unit. Silas walked ahead slightly, his pace set by the rhythm of someone accustomed to moving toward outcomes rather than alongside others. Iliana followed at her own pace, not slower, not faster, but separate enough that the distance between them felt natural. The building that housed Victor Hale's office stood in Midtown Manhattan, its exterior polished to a degree that reflected both wealth and discretion. Inside, the atmosphere was controlled, quiet, efficient, the kind of environment where decisions were made without spectacle. They were expected. Of course they were. Victor Hale greeted them in the conference room. He was exactly as Iliana had anticipated, composed, precise, with an expression that rarely shifted beyond what was professionally required. Mr. Caldwell. Miss Marchand, he said, extending a hand to each in turn. Iliana shook his hand once. Firm. Brief. No excess. Shall we begin? Victor asked. Silas took his seat without hesitation. Iliana sat across from him. The table between them was already prepared, documents arranged in sequence, each section marked, each page aligned. A legal assistant stood near the wall, tablet in hand, ready to record signatures, timestamps, confirmations. Everything was procedural. Victor began with a summary, not because it was necessary, but because it was expected. This agreement reflects the terms previously discussed, he said. A mutual dissolution of marriage with no contestation from either party. Asset division has been outlined according to pre-existing ownership structures. His voice remained even neutral, devoid of interpretation. Iliana listened. Not for content, she had already reviewed it, but for framing. There was none. Only execution. Silas leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested confidence rather than comfort. He had positioned himself for this moment long before it arrived. As Victor turned to the first page, Silas spoke. Let's be efficient, he said. No need to overcomplicate. Victor inclined his head slightly. Of course. The documents were passed to Iliana first, a gesture of formality, nothing more. She read each page again, not because she needed to, but because she always did. Words mattered. Placement mattered. Even when nothing changed, verification remained essential. Across from her, Silas watched, not closely, but with the kind of attention reserved for processes already concluded in the mind. At one point, he exhaled softly, almost amused. "You know," he said, glancing toward Victor, "this is probably the most straightforward separation you've handled in a while." Victor did not respond. It was not his role to agree. Silas continued, his tone light, conversational. "No disputes, no claims. Clean exit." He shifted his gaze toward Iliana. "You're handling it well," he added. "Not everyone does." Iliana looked up briefly. "I understand the terms," she said. Silas smiled faintly. "That's one way to put it." There was a pause, not uncomfortable but deliberate. Then, as if completing a thought he had already formed, Silas added, "Let's be honest, this works out for you. Walking away without complications. Considering you came into this with nothing." The words settled into the room with a clarity that did not require emphasis. The legal assistant's hand paused momentarily over the tablet. Victor remained still. Iliana did not react. Not outwardly. Because reaction would have shifted the moment. And the moment as it existed was useful. Silas leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "I mean, really," he continued, his tone still controlled, still almost casual. "No debts, no obligations. You're free. That's more than fair." Fair. The word lingered. Iliana's gaze returned to the document in front of her. She turned the page. Her movements remained steady, uninterrupted by tone, by implication, by anything that existed outside the structure of the process itself. Because Iliana was not responding to Silas. She was observing him, recording not with her notebook, which remained in her bag, but with the same internal precision that had guided her for years. Tone, dismissive, controlled. Context, public setting, legal environment. Witnesses present. Pattern confirmed. She reached the final page. Victor spoke again. "If there are no further questions, we can proceed with signatures." Silas picked up his pen immediately. "No questions," he said. He signed with confidence, his name written quickly, decisively, as if the act itself required no weight. Then he set the pen down and leaned back. "Your turn," he said, looking at Iliana. There was no hostility in his voice. Only certainty. Iliana picked up the pen. For a brief moment, so brief it might have gone unnoticed, her phone vibrated against the table. Once. Then stillness. No one looked at it. Not Victor. Not the assistant. Not Silas. Iliana's hand paused, not in hesitation but in awareness. She did not reach for the phone. She did not check the screen. Because she already knew. There was only one message she had been waiting for. And its timing. Aligned. She signed her name. Iliana Marchand. The ink settled into the paper with quiet finality. Victor nodded. "I'll have copies prepared for both parties," he said. The assistant stepped forward, collecting the documents, her movements efficient, silent. Silas stood. "That's that," he said, adjusting his jacket. "Clean." He glanced at Iliana one last time, not searching for reaction but confirming absence of it. "You'll be fine," he added. "You always are." It was meant perhaps as reassurance, or perhaps as dismissal. The distinction no longer mattered. Iliana stood as well. "Yes," she said. She reached for her phone. The screen lit as her fingers touched it. Subject line: "Final asset transfer completed." She did not open it. Not here. Not now. Because confirmation, she understood, did not require witnesses. Silas had already turned toward the door, speaking quietly to Victor about something unrelated, his voice shifting back into the cadence of business of forward movement. He did not look back. Iliana followed her steps, measured her expression unchanged. Behind her, the documents were being processed. Copies made records, stored the legal conclusion of something Silas believed he had controlled from beginning to end. But control, Iliana knew, was not defined at the moment it was declared. It was defined at the moment it was understood. And as she stepped out into the corridor, the phone still in her hand, the message unopened, but fully acknowledged, Iliana Marchand understood something with complete clarity. Nothing had ended. It had only shifted. Iliana did not go home immediately after leaving the building. The city moved around her in its usual rhythm taxis, threading through traffic pedestrians, adjusting their pace to invisible currents, conversations dissolving into the general hum of Manhattan. But Iliana remained slightly outside of it, as though she were walking parallel to something rather than within it. Her phone was still in her hand. The message remained unopened, not out of hesitation, out of discipline. She crossed the street, turned once without apparent direction, and entered a quiet cafe set back from the main avenue. It was not crowded. Mid-morning had already passed, and the space held only a few scattered patrons, each occupied with their own private concerns. Iliana chose a table near the window, not for the view, for the light. She ordered nothing. Instead, she placed her phone on the table, aligned it with the edge, and sat still for a moment, not thinking, not anticipating, but allowing the transition to complete itself. For years, Iliana had lived in a state of deferred clarity. She had observed, recorded, waited, not because she lacked understanding, but because understanding alone did not create change. Timing did. And now, for the first time, timing and structure had aligned. Only then did she reach for the phone. The screen responded immediately. Final asset transfer completed. She opened the email. There was no dramatic language inside, no embellishment. Only confirmation, structured, formal, precise. Legal verification complete. Control transferred. Accounts activated. Authority recognized across all relevant jurisdictions. Attached were documents, dozens of them. Ownership certifications. Board transition notices. Authorization letters granting her decision-making power over entities that extended far beyond what most individuals would encounter in a lifetime. Iliana did not scroll quickly. She read each section with the same attention she had given everything else, line by line, without skipping, without assumption. $30 billion. The number appeared more than once, though always framed differently. Valuation summaries, asset distributions, projected liquidity. It was not a single figure, but a network of figures, each representing a component of something far larger than its sum. She did not react, because reaction would have been misplaced. This was not an arrival, it was a confirmation. Everything that had been set into motion long before Silas had decided to end the marriage, long before Iliana had even understood the full extent of Iliana Marchand's world, had now resolved into something actionable. Control, not theoretical, not pending. Real. Iliana closed the email, not because she had finished reading, but because she had seen enough to proceed. Her reflection faintly appeared in the glass beside her, layered over the movement of the city beyond. For a brief moment, the image held two realities occupying the same space. Then it shifted. She reached into her bag and removed her notebook. The familiar weight settled into her hands. She opened to a new page. Date, time, subject asset transfer confirmed. She did not write the number. Numbers could be referenced later. Instead, she wrote what mattered. Control established. Then beneath it, Silas Caldwell, no longer structurally relevant. The line was not emotional. It was factual. Because whatever connection had existed between them, legal, financial, personal, had now been formally severed. And in its place, there was nothing. Not loss. Not absence. Just completion. Iliana did not return to the apartment she had shared with Silas. That too had been decided in advance. Before the signing, before the confirmation, she had arranged for a smaller space, temporary but sufficient. A one-bedroom apartment in a quieter part of the city, far from the networks that defined Silas's world. It was not designed to impress. It was designed to function. The lease had been signed 2 days earlier. Silas did not know. He did not need to. By the time he returned home that evening, Iliana would no longer be there. Not dramatically, not abruptly, simply absent. The apartment was exactly as she remembered it. Minimal, clean, structured around utility rather than display. A desk near the window, a narrow bookshelf, a kitchen that held only what was necessary. Iliana placed her bag on the table and moved through the space once, as if confirming its dimensions. There was no need to unpack immediately. There was no urgency, because for the first time in years, Iliana was not operating within someone else's structure. She was defining her own. Her phone buzzed. This time she checked it. A message from Eleanor. "It's done. We should meet this afternoon. There are next steps." Iliana read it once. then replied, "What time?" The response came quickly. 3:00 p.m. Office. Iliana set the phone down. Next steps. Of course. Because control once established did not remain static. It required management, understanding, and eventually decision. Eleanor's office felt different that afternoon. Not in appearance, in context. Where the previous meetings had been preparatory, this one carried a different weight, subtle but present. Eleanor stood as Iliana entered. "It's confirmed," she said. Iliana nodded. "I've read the documentation." Eleanor gestured toward the table. "Good. Then we can move forward." They sat. This time the documents were not introductions. They were operational. "These are the primary divisions," Eleanor explained, sliding several folders across the table. "Energy infrastructure, private equity, logistics. Each has its own executive structure, but ultimate authority now roots through you." Iliana opened the first folder. The scale was no longer abstract. It was segmented, defined. Manageable not in size, but in structure. "I want a full audit," Iliana said. Eleanor paused, studying her. "Of everything?" she asked. "Yes. That will take time." "I'm not in a hurry," Iliana replied. Eleanor considered that, then nodded. "All right." She made a note. "Anything specific you're concerned about?" she asked. Iliana's gaze remained on the document. "Yes," she said. She turned a page. "There are intersections," she continued, "with external entities. Some of them connect to prior observations." Eleanor understood immediately. "Silas," she said. Iliana did not respond. She didn't need to. Eleanor leaned back slightly. "We'll include that in the audit," she said. "But carefully. If there's exposure, we need to understand its depth before we act." Iliana nodded. "Agreed." There was a brief silence, not empty but transitional. Then Eleanor spoke again. "You realize," she said, "that from this point forward your decisions will carry weight beyond personal consequence." Iliana looked up. "I understand." Eleanor held her gaze for a moment longer, then inclined her head slightly. "Good." That evening, Iliana returned to her new apartment. The city outside had shifted into night, the lights sharper, now more defined. Movement continued, but it felt different, less like momentum, more like repetition. Iliana sat at the desk, her notebook open. She reviewed the entries from the past weeks, not to revisit, but to integrate. The patterns she had documented, the structures she had uncovered, the decisions that had been made by Silas, by others, by systems that operated without visibility. All of it now existed within a framework she controlled. Not completely, not yet, but sufficiently. She turned to a new page. At the top she wrote Phase 1 observation complete. Beneath it Phase 2, verification in progress. Then, after a brief pause, Phase 3, action pending. Iliana closed the notebook. The room was quiet, not empty, just quiet. And in that quiet, for the first time, there was no need to anticipate what came next, because whatever came next would be decided by her. Control once transferred did not announce itself through power. It revealed itself through responsibility. The morning after her meeting with Eleanor, Iliana did not wake with a sense of arrival. There was no moment of reflection where the scale of what she now held settled into something personal. Instead, she woke with a list, already forming, structured, deliberate, necessary. Authority, she understood, was not a position. It was a function, and functions required systems. By 8:30, she was seated in a conference room on the 42nd floor of a building that did not carry the Marchand name publicly, but operated as one of its central administrative nodes. The room was designed for clarity, glass walls controlled, lighting a table large enough to accommodate discussion without crowding it. 3 people were already present. Eleanor Vance, as expected. A man in his early 50s, composed, precise in posture, Daniel Reeves, Chief Financial Officer of Marchand Global Holdings. And a younger woman, late 30s, sharp-eyed with a tablet already open in front of her. Maya Chen, Head of Compliance. Iliana took her seat without ceremony. Daniel inclined his head slightly. "Miss Marchand," he said, "we've been expecting you." Iliana acknowledged him with a brief nod. "Let's begin," she said. There was no need for introductions beyond what had already been provided. Eleanor glanced at Daniel, who began without hesitation. "I'll start with an overview," he said, tapping the screen in front of him. A projection appeared on the glass wall, clean, segmented, structured into divisions. Marchand Global Holdings currently operates across 4 primary sectors: energy infrastructure, logistics, and private equity. Each sector is independently managed, but all strategic decisions ultimately require approval at the holding level. He paused, allowing the structure to settle. Until now, he continued that approval was distributed through a board structure designed during Mr. Marchand's later years. With the transfer completed, that authority now consolidates through you. Iliana watched the projection not as a display but as a map. "Current liabilities?" she asked. Daniel did not seem surprised by the question. "Minimal at the holding level," he replied. "Some leveraged positions within specific subsidiaries, but all within acceptable risk parameters." "Acceptable by whose definition?" Iliana asked. A brief pause. Then Daniel allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible shift in expression. "By industry standards," he said. Iliana held his gaze for a moment. "Noted," she replied. Maya Chen spoke next. "From a compliance standpoint," she said, "the structure is stable. There are no active investigations, no outstanding violations." However, she paused, glancing briefly at Eleanor. "There are areas where increased transparency may be advisable." Iliana turned slightly toward her. "Specify." Maya adjusted the tablet, bringing up a different set of data. "Certain investment channels, particularly within the private equity division, utilize layered intermediary entities. This is not uncommon, but it does create opacity." Opacity. Iliana recognized the word not as description, but as warning. "How many?" she asked. "Approximately 12 primary structures," Maya said, "each with multiple sub-entities." Iliana nodded once. "I want a full audit of all 12, she said. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "That will require time," he said. "And discretion. Some of those structures involve external partners who may resist. Then we proceed without resistance," Iliana said calmly. "Quietly. Internally." Daniel studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Understood." Eleanor watched the exchange without interruption. Iliana continued. "I also want cross-referencing between those entities and any legal firms involved in their formation or management." Maya's fingers paused briefly over her tablet. "Legal firms?" she asked. "Yes," Eleanor spoke then. "There's a potential intersection," she said, her tone measured. "One we'll need to examine carefully." Daniel's attention sharpened. With what he asked, Eleanor did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked to Iliana. Iliana held the silence for a moment, not as hesitation but as control. Then she spoke. "Caldwell and Pierce, LLP," she said. The name settled into the room. Daniel's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to register recognition. "They've handled several mid-level transactions in the past," he said. "Nothing directly tied to core holdings." "Indirectly?" Iliana asked. Daniel glanced at Maya. Maya adjusted her screen again. "There are connections," she said. "Not extensive, but present. Mostly through intermediary funds." Iliana leaned back slightly in her chair, not relaxing, but recalibrating. "Include them in the audit," she said. Daniel hesitated. "That could draw attention," he said. "Only if it's visible," Iliana replied. The room held for a moment. Then Daniel nodded. "All right." The meeting continued for nearly 2 hours. Each section of the structure was examined, not in exhaustive detail, but in enough depth to establish direction. Iliana did not attempt to absorb everything at once. She identified pressure points instead, areas where information condensed, where decisions carried disproportionate weight. Revenue flows, liability exposure, external dependencies. She asked fewer questions than expected, but each one shifted the focus of the room. By the time the meeting concluded, the tone had changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. What had begun as a briefing had become alignment. Iliana stood. "Daily updates," she said. "Condensed. No summaries, raw data." Daniel nodded. "You'll have them." Maya added, "I'll prioritize the audit." Eleanor said nothing. She didn't need to. Outside the building, the city moved with its usual indifference. Iliana stepped onto the sidewalk and paused briefly, not to reflect but to transition. Control had shifted. Now structure would follow. That afternoon in her apartment, Iliana reviewed the first set of documents Daniel had sent. They were exactly as requested. Unfiltered. Dense. Not designed for convenience. She worked through them methodically, cross-referencing with her notebook, aligning new information with existing patterns. And gradually something began to emerge. Not a contradiction. A convergence. Certain entities' names she had seen before in Silas's documents appeared within the broader network. Not prominently. Not in ways that would draw immediate scrutiny. But consistently, the same way a pattern forms not through visibility but through repetition. Iliana marked each instance. No conclusions. Not yet. Only connections. That evening her phone buzzed. Silas. The name appeared on the screen without context. Iliana looked at it for a moment. Not surprised. Not curious. Simply aware. She did not answer. The call ended. A message followed. We need to finalize a few things. Logistics. Let me know when you're available. Iliana read it once, then set the phone down. Logistics. The word felt distant now. Not irrelevant, but no longer central. She opened her notebook. New entry. Date. Time. Subject Caldwell post-divorce contact. She wrote the message down. Exactly as it appeared. Then beneath it a single line, no response required. Across the room, the documents remained open, structures, numbers, connections that extended far beyond a single conversation. And within that structure, Silas Caldwell was no longer a variable to consider. He was a point of reference, nothing more. Late that night, Iliana stood by the window, the city, stretching out below her in quiet repetition. She had spent years observing systems from the outside. Now, she stood within one, not as a participant, as its center. But Iliana did not mistake position for understanding. Control had been transferred. Structure was forming. But the pattern, the full pattern, had not yet revealed itself completely. And Iliana, as always, would not act until it did. Patterns once visible rarely remain contained. They expand. Not because they grow, but because the observer begins to recognize their reach. In the days following the initial audit directives, Iliana's role within Marchand Global Holdings shifted from passive confirmation to active filtration. Information began to arrive with increasing frequency. Raw data streams, transaction logs, internal memos, compliance summaries. Each one dense, each one requiring interpretation. She did not attempt to read everything. She selected, carefully. Because volume, she understood, was often used to obscure clarity. Every morning, a structured report appeared in her inbox, compiled by Daniel Reeves's team. It contained what he had promised, unfiltered data, stripped of executive summary, organized only by category and timestamp. To most, it would have been overwhelming. To Iliana, it was familiar. Not in content, in form. It resembled her notebooks, only larger, more complex, and less honest. Because raw data, while unfiltered, was not neutral. It was arranged. And arrangement implied intention. Iliana sat at her desk, the documents spread across the surface in a deliberate order. Her notebook lay open beside them, not as a primary record anymore, but as a tool for alignment. She had begun translating the digital structure into something more tangible. Connections required space, and space required visibility. Her pen moved steadily across the page, drawing lines between entities, marking recurring names, identifying timestamps that overlapped in ways that could not be dismissed as coincidence. One name appeared again, then again. Pierce Strategic Holdings. It was not a central entity, not one that commanded attention, but it existed at the edges of multiple transactions, appearing briefly, then disappearing, always in proximity to movements that carried more weight. Iliana circled it once. Not as a conclusion, as a marker. She reached for another document, a transaction summary from 3 months earlier. The structure was similar. Funds moved through intermediary accounts, consolidated, then redirected toward a larger investment pool. And again, Pierce Strategic Holdings. The pattern held. Iliana did not assume intent. She verified, cross-referencing timestamps, aligning transaction IDs, tracking the sequence. The structure revealed itself gradually, not through a single document but through repetition. Funds entered through one channel, moved through a secondary entity, passed briefly through Pierce Strategic Holdings, then emerged elsewhere. clean, recontextualized. Iliana leaned back slightly, not in satisfaction, in recognition. This was not random. It was design. That afternoon she met with Maya Chen in a smaller conference room, one without projection screens, without the formal structure of executive meetings. The space was quieter, more contained, designed for detail rather than presentation. Maya arrived with a tablet and a stack of printed reports. "I've started mapping the 12 entities you flagged," she said, taking her seat. "There's overlap, but not enough to establish direct coordination yet." Iliana slid one of her own documents across the table. "Look at this," she said. Maya studied it briefly. Her expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to indicate interest. "Pierce Strategic," she said. "Yes." Maya tapped the screen, pulling up additional data. "They're minor," she said. "Limited declared activity. Mostly passive holdings." "Declared," Iliana repeated. Maya glanced at her. "You think they're a conduit?" It was not a question. Iliana did not answer immediately. Instead, she placed a second document on the table, then a third, each one marked, each one connected. Maya's eyes moved quickly now, tracing the pattern Iliana had already identified. The silence stretched, not empty, but concentrated. Finally, Maya exhaled quietly. "That's consistent," she said. Iliana nodded once. "Track their origin," she said. "Formation documents. Legal representation." Maya's fingers moved across the tablet. A moment passed. "Then Caldwell and Pierce LLP," she said. The name settled between them. Iliana's gaze remained steady. "Of course," Maya added. "They've handled a wide range of formations. This doesn't necessarily mean it means proximity," Iliana said. Maya stopped, then nodded. "Yes," she said. "It does." Later that evening, Iliana reviewed the additional materials Maya had forwarded. Formation dates, ownership structures, legal filings. Each document added weight not by itself, but in relation to the others. Caldwell and Pierce appeared repeatedly, not as a central authority, but as a facilitator. A firm that structured, that advised, that enabled. Silas's name did not appear directly, not on any of the documents. But his absence did not indicate distance. It indicated design. Because Silas had always understood something fundamental. Visibility created liability. Iliana closed the final document. The pattern was no longer incomplete. It was simply unconfirmed. And confirmation, she knew, required more than inference. It required evidence that could withstand scrutiny. The next morning she met with Eleanor again. This time the atmosphere was different, not preparatory, not exploratory, focused. Iliana placed the compiled documents on the table. Eleanor reviewed them in silence. Page after page. Her expression remained controlled, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a tightening almost imperceptible that suggested recognition. When she finished, she closed the folder. "This is no longer theoretical," she said. Iliana said nothing. Eleanor leaned back slightly. "You have a pattern of structured movement through intermediary entities tied to a firm with known access to these channels." She paused. "And given your prior documentation," her gaze lifted, "this becomes significant." Iliana met her eyes. "Is it enough?" she asked. Eleanor considered. "Not yet," she said. "But it's close." She tapped the folder lightly. "What you need now is confirmation of intent. Something that shows awareness, participation." Iliana understood. Transactions could be explained. Structures could be justified. Intent could not. "Emails," Eleanor continued. "Internal communications. Anything that connects decision to action." Iliana's mind moved quickly, not searching but recalling. There had been documents, not in the open, but accessible. She had seen them once, briefly. In Silas's study. Printed, reviewed, set aside. She had not taken them. At the time, they had not been necessary. Now they were. "I know where to look," Iliana said. Eleanor studied her. "Be careful," she said. "If he suspects, he won't," Iliana replied. Not with confidence, with certainty. Because Silas even now did not see her as someone who acted, only someone who observed. And that, Iliana understood, remained his greatest miscalculation. That night, Iliana returned to her apartment, but she did not stay long. She retrieved her notebook, reviewed a single page, then closed it. Within it, she had already recorded the layout of the study, the placement of documents, the habits Silas followed without variation. Patterns. Always patterns. She stood by the door for a moment, not hesitating but aligning. Then she left. The city outside was quieter now, the late hour thinning the movement into something more predictable. Iliana moved through it without drawing attention, her steps measured, her expression unchanged. She was not returning to something familiar. She was returning to something unfinished. And this time she was not going to observe. She was going to confirm. Return, Iliana understood, was not the same as revisiting. It was a recalculation of distance. The apartment she had once shared with Silas still existed in the same physical space, same building, same quiet lobby, same elevator that moved without sound, but it no longer held the same structure in her mind. It was no longer a place of residence. It was a location, a site containing information she had not yet fully extracted. She entered without hesitation. The doorman recognized her, offering a brief nod. No questions, no shift in expression. To him, nothing had changed. That, Iliana knew, was often how systems preserved themselves, by maintaining appearances even after their foundations had shifted. Upstairs, the apartment was exactly as she had left it. Silas was not home. That too aligned. His schedule had become increasingly predictable in its intensity: late meetings, extended calls, commitments that required presence elsewhere. He had not expected Iliana to return. He had not imagined she would need to. Iliana closed the door behind her quietly and stood still for a moment, not listening for movement, but allowing her memory to align with the present. Nothing had been disturbed. The arrangement of objects remained intact. Control, she thought, often depended on the assumption that no one would look closely. She moved toward the study. The room was dim, illuminated only by the ambient light from the hallway. She did not turn on the overhead light. Instead, she crossed to the desk and switched on the smaller lamp positioned at the corner. A contained glow. Enough to see, not enough to draw attention. Everything was where she remembered it. The desk ordered, but not meticulously so. Silas preferred accessibility over perfection. Documents were arranged in loose stacks, some clipped, others left open as though they had been reviewed recently. Iliana approached without urgency. She did not begin by searching. She began by observing. What had changed since the last time she had been here? Very little. Which meant the pattern remained stable. She opened the top drawer. Inside, standard materials, stationery, a few folders, nothing that required further attention. The second drawer contained more. Printed documents. Some familiar, some new. Iliana did not remove them immediately. Instead, she noted their arrangement, the order in which they had been placed, the edges that suggested recent handling. Then she began. One document at a time. She lifted the first stack and placed it on the desk. Transaction summaries. She had seen similar structures before. She set them aside. The second stack. Internal memos. Brief coded language, references to timelines, approvals, coordination. She paused. Not at the content, at the tone. There was a difference between communication that documented action and communication that anticipated it. These did both. Iliana reached into her bag and removed her phone. Not to read. To capture. Each page photographed with precision. No flash. No sound. She moved methodically, ensuring that each image was clear, each section preserved in full. The third stack was thinner, more selective. Emails. Printed. Highlighted in sections. That alone was unusual. Silas rarely printed emails unless they required focused review. Iliana's attention sharpened, not visibly but internally. She picked up the first page. The sender was not immediately recognizable, but the content, direct, unfiltered, references to fund movement, to timing, to adjustments required before disclosure thresholds are triggered. Iliana read it once, then again, not for meaning, for structure. Then she photographed it. The next page, a reply, shorter, from a different address. But the language, familiar. Not in phrasing, in intention. She continued. Page after page. Each one adding weight. Not individually, but collectively, until the pattern she had identified no longer required interpretation. It was explicit. Coordination, awareness, participation, intent. Iliana placed the final page back into its position within the stack, exactly as she had found it. Then she closed the drawer. No disruption, no trace. She stood still for a moment, her gaze moving once across the room, not searching but confirming. Everything remained as it had been, which meant nothing had been altered, and everything had been taken. She left the apartment the same way she had entered, quietly, without drawing attention. The hallway remained empty. The elevator arrived without delay. The lobby unchanged. Outside, the city had deepened into night. Iliana stepped onto the street and paused briefly, not to reflect but to transition. Her phone remained in her hand, the images stored, unreviewed. For now, because confirmation, she understood, did not require immediate analysis. It required proper handling. Eleanor did not ask questions when Iliana arrived at her office later that night. She simply looked at her and understood. Iliana placed her phone on the table. "Review these," she said. Eleanor picked it up, scrawled. Her expression did not shift dramatically, but the stillness in the room changed. When she finished, she set the phone down slowly. "This is it," she said. Not loudly, not with emphasis, but with certainty. Iliana remained silent. Eleanor leaned back slightly, her gaze fixed on the documents she had just seen. "This establishes intent," she continued. "Direct communication, awareness of structure, participation in timing." She paused. "There's no ambiguity here." Iliana nodded once. "What's the process?" she asked. Eleanor exhaled slowly, not from hesitation but from calculation. "We don't go public," she said. "Not yet." Iliana expected that. "We formalize the evidence," Eleanor continued. "Chain of custody, authentication. We build a case that can withstand scrutiny at every level." She met Iliana's gaze. And then she added, "We decide where to send it." "SEC?" Iliana asked. "Possibly," Eleanor said. "Also, federal prosecutors depending on scope. This crosses multiple jurisdictions." Iliana considered that. Not the outcome, the sequence. "How long?" she asked. "Long enough to do it correctly," Eleanor replied. Iliana nodded. "Then we proceed." The following days were quiet. Externally, internally, everything accelerated. The documents Iliana had collected were transferred into secure systems, reviewed by legal specialists, verified against existing data. Every detail cross-checked, every timestamp aligned. The pattern held. Not only held, it strengthened. Because now it was no longer inferred. It was documented. Silas Caldwell had not simply existed near the structure. He had helped shape it. And that distinction, that difference between proximity and participation, was everything. Silas, meanwhile, remained unaware. Or rather, he remained within the same structure he had always operated in. One where control was assumed, where visibility was managed, where outcomes were directed rather than questioned. He noticed small things, perhaps. That Iliana had not responded to his message. That the apartment felt different. But these observations did not lead to concern. Because concern required recognition. And recognition required a shift in perception. Silas had not yet reached that point. One evening, Iliana stood again by the window of her apartment, the city stretching out beneath her in its endless repetition of light and movement. Her notebook lay open behind her. A new entry had been added. Not detailed, not extensive, just one line. Pattern confirmed. She did not add anything else. Because there was nothing left to observe. Only what came next. And what came next would not require her voice. Action, when it finally arrives, does not announce itself with force. It arrives with alignment. By the time Iliana and Eleanor moved forward, the decision had already been made, not in a single moment, but through a sequence of confirmations so precise that hesitation no longer served any purpose. Every document had been reviewed, every inconsistency tested against alternative explanations, every connection traced far enough to ensure that what they held was not merely compelling but durable. Durability, Eleanor had said more than once, was the difference between accusation and consequence. They met in a secured conference room, one that existed outside the main offices Eleanor typically used. It was smaller, windowless, designed less for presentation and more for containment. The table held only what was necessary: encrypted drives, printed summaries, and a laptop connected to a network that did not route through standard systems. Nothing in the room was accidental. Eleanor sat at one end reviewing a final checklist. Across from her, a man Iliana had not met before, Thomas Redding, a specialist in federal financial investigations, scanned through a digital file with the kind of focus that suggested familiarity with complexity. Iliana took her seat without introduction. Eleanor closed the folder in front of her. "We're ready," she said. The words were not dramatic. They were procedural. Thomas glanced up briefly, acknowledging Iliana with a slight nod before returning his attention to the screen. "I've reviewed the materials your team compiled," he said. "Transaction trails, intermediary structures, communication logs. It's thorough." He paused not for effect, but to measure his next words. "You've established a clear pattern of coordinated movement designed to obscure origin and timing. The email chain you provided is particularly useful. It demonstrates awareness, not just execution." Iliana listened without interruption. "What happens next?" she asked. Thomas leaned back slightly. "That depends on how you want to proceed," he said. "There are multiple channels. The Securities and Exchange Commission for one. The Department of Justice, if criminal intent is pursued. Each has its own process, its own timeline." Eleanor spoke then. "We're not interested in speed," she said. "We're interested in precision." Thomas nodded. "Then we build the submission carefully," he said. "No gaps, no assumptions. Everything supported, everything traceable." Iliana considered that. Not the complexity, the sequence. When it submitted, she asked what changes. Thomas's gaze shifted toward her. "Visibility," he said. "Not public visibility, at least not immediately, but institutional awareness. Once it's in the system, it begins to move." He paused. "And once it begins to move, it doesn't stop easily." Iliana nodded. That was sufficient. The process began that afternoon, not with a single submission, but with preparation layered across multiple channels. Eleanor's team handled legal structuring, ensuring that every document was authenticated, every chain of custody documented, every potential challenge anticipated before it could arise. Thomas coordinated the investigative pathway, identifying the appropriate entry points, the divisions most likely to act efficiently without unnecessary delay. Iliana did not direct the process in visible ways. She aligned it. Decisions were made quietly, often in the form of questions rather than statements. Where is this most stable? What creates the least interference? What ensures continuity? Each answer refined the path forward. The evidence itself was organized into a structure that mirrored the pattern it revealed. Not chronological, not thematic, sequential. From origin to movement to intent. Bank records established the flow. Entity structures established the concealment. Emails established the awareness. Together they formed something that did not require interpretation, only recognition. 3 days later, the submission was complete. Not sent. Ready. Eleanor reviewed the final package once more, her attention moving across each section with the same precision she had applied from the beginning. "No revisions," she said finally. Thomas nodded. "This will hold." Iliana stood near the window, not looking out but standing in a position that allowed distance from the table. When she asked, Eleanor checked the time. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "First filing window." Iliana turned slightly. "Do it." No emphasis. No hesitation. The decision had already been made. The submission was executed without ceremony. No announcement. No visible marker. At 9:02 a.m. the files entered the system. At 9:04 confirmations were received. At 9:07 the process began. Iliana did not watch it happen. She was already at her desk reviewing a separate set of documents related to Marchand Holdings. The structure she now oversaw did not pause simply because another had been set into motion. Responsibility did not shift. It expanded. Silas Caldwell noticed the change before he understood it. It began as a delay. A call that was not returned as quickly as expected. A document that required additional review. A meeting that was postponed without clear explanation. Individually, these were not unusual, but together they disrupted the rhythm he relied on. He adjusted as he always did, reaching out, clarifying, reasserting control where necessary. But the responses he received carried a different tone. Measured, distant, procedural. as though something had shifted beyond his reach. He did not yet recognize the source, but he felt the effect. 2 days after the submission, Eleanor received the first acknowledgement. Not from a public office, from within the system. "They've opened it," she said, placing the message in front of Iliana. Iliana read it once. No details, just confirmation. "Review initiated." "That was fast," Iliana said. Thomas, who had joined them again that afternoon, nodded slightly. "Quality accelerates attention," he said. "You gave them something they can act on." Iliana closed the message, and now Thomas leaned back. "Now we wait," he said, "but not passively. They'll begin pulling their own data, cross-referencing, verifying independently." He paused. "If everything aligns with what you've provided." He did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Silas's situation shifted more noticeably by the end of the week. The deal he had referenced, the one that was supposed to change everything, encountered resistance. Not direct, subtle. Regulatory questions, requests for clarification, delays framed as standard procedure. But the accumulation created pressure, and pressure revealed structure. He spent longer hours at the office, shorter conversations at home, though home now was no longer shared. The absence of Iliana had registered, but only as a logistical change. He had not yet connected it to anything beyond that. Iliana remained where she had always been, not in location, in approach, she observed. Not Silas directly, but the system around him. Because systems, unlike individuals, did not conceal reaction well. They adjusted, they tightened, they responded to input. And in those responses, Iliana saw what she needed. Not confirmation. That had already been established. But progression. The process had begun. And once begun, it would continue layer by layer, review by review, until it reached its natural conclusion. Iliana did not anticipate that conclusion. She did not imagine it. She did not prepare for it emotionally. Because the outcome was no longer her responsibility. Only the action had been. And that action had already been taken. Exposure, when it reaches its threshold, does not arrive with spectacle. It unfolds with a kind of quiet inevitability, where each layer reveals itself not through force, but through the simple refusal of facts to remain concealed. By the time the formal hearing was scheduled, the process had already advanced beyond the point where individual influence could meaningfully redirect it. What remained was not a question of whether something would surface, but how completely it would be understood once it did. The notice reached Silas Caldwell late in the evening, delivered through official channels that did not require acknowledgement to assert authority. It was precise, structured, and entirely impersonal. Time, location, scope of inquiry, and his role within it clearly defined. Participant, not advisor, not counsel. Participant. Silas read the document standing near his desk, the city visible behind him through the wide glass panel that had always, until recently, reinforced his sense of elevation. The skyline had not changed. The lights were arranged as they had always been, steady, distant, indifferent. But something in the relationship between him and that view had shifted. He read the notice again more slowly, this time not for comprehension but for implication. The entities listed were familiar. The dates aligned with transactions he had structured himself. The language, while neutral, carried a level of specificity that made one thing unmistakably clear. This was not a preliminary inquiry. This was a continuation, and it had already been informed. Silas placed the document on his desk with controlled precision. His movements did not betray urgency, but the stillness that followed was not the stillness of confidence. It was the stillness of recalibration, an internal process he had relied on throughout his career, now applied to a situation that did not fully conform to the frameworks he understood. He reached for his phone, paused, then set it back down. There were calls he could make, conversations he could initiate, but each of those actions, he understood, operated within a system that had already begun to move independently of him. For the first time, response was no longer equivalent to control. The morning of the hearing arrived without disruption. No media, no visible attention. The building itself was deliberately unremarkable, its function concealed behind neutrality, its purpose understood only by those required to enter it. Inside, the atmosphere was calibrated to remove everything except process. There were no unnecessary details, no visual cues that suggested importance or consequence. Only structure. Silas arrived early, not because he needed time to prepare, but because preparation for him had always been a form of positioning. To arrive early was to establish presence, to understand the environment before it began to act upon him. But as he sat in the waiting room, quiet, enclosed, absent of distraction, he became aware of something unfamiliar. There was nothing to read, nothing to anticipate, no signals to interpret. The system did not present itself for observation. It operated. When he was called in, the transition was seamless. The room was already arranged. 3 individuals sat across from the table, each with documents placed before them, each expression controlled to a degree that rendered interpretation unnecessary. A recording device rested at the center, its presence not emphasized but undeniable. Silas took his seat. There was no introduction beyond the formal acknowledgement of identity. Then, the process began. The first question was simple. Mr. Caldwell, can you confirm your involvement in the structuring of entities associated with Pierce Strategic Holdings? Silas responded without hesitation. Yes. His voice was steady, measured, because acknowledgement in itself did not imply liability. The second question followed. And can you confirm the timeline of your involvement in transactions dated between March and September of last year? The documents were placed before him one by one, not as evidence to be debated, but as records to be aligned with his responses. Each page corresponded to a transaction he recognized, each entry structured in a way that left little room for reinterpretation. The sequence was deliberate, not designed to confront, designed to establish. Silas adjusted his posture slightly, leaning forward just enough to signal engagement without concession. He had navigated complex negotiations before, situations where information was partial, where control could be reasserted through language, through framing, through timing. But this was not negotiation. This was reconstruction, and reconstruction did not require his agreement. It required his confirmation. The questions continued, not rapidly, not aggressively, but with a consistency that revealed their purpose. Were you aware of intermediary entities utilized in the redistribution of these funds? Yes. Did you participate in the selection of those entities? Yes. Were you informed of compliance thresholds related to disclosure requirements? Yes. Each answer aligned with a document. Each document aligned with a pattern, and gradually the distinction between individual actions and systemic design began to dissolve. Silas became aware of it not suddenly but through accumulation. The realization did not arrive as panic. It arrived as recognition. The structure he had built carefully, deliberately, with an understanding of where visibility could be managed, was now being reconstructed without reliance on his interpretation. And within that reconstruction, intent was no longer abstract. It was inferred through sequence, through repetition, through consistency. At one point, a document was placed before him that he recognized immediately. An email, printed, highlighted in sections he remembered reviewing. His gaze remained steady, but something beneath it shifted, not externally visible, but internally undeniable. Can you confirm that this communication reflects your awareness of timing adjustments made to avoid disclosure thresholds? Silas read the highlighted section once, then looked up. Yes. The words settled into the room without emphasis. But its weight was different, because this time the confirmation did not align with process alone. It aligned with intent. Across the city, Iliana Marchand did not sit in a room like that. She did not hear the questions. She did not watch the documents being placed one after another in a sequence designed to reveal what she had already understood. Instead, she sat at her desk reviewing a report that outlined projected shifts in one of Marchand Holdings' infrastructure divisions. The document required attention, numbers, timelines, decisions that would affect operations in ways that extended beyond immediate visibility. She read it carefully, made notes, asked questions of her own team, because the structure she now held did not pause for the unraveling of another. And Iliana, as always, moved forward. Not because the past no longer mattered, but because its outcome had already been set into motion. The hearing did not conclude with a declaration. There was no moment of resolution, no statement that defined what would follow. Instead, it ended the way it had begun, with procedure. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. We will be in contact." Silas stood, collected his documents, left the room. The hallway outside was the same as before, neutral, quiet, absent of indication that anything of consequence had occurred within it. But as he stepped outside the building and into the open air, the city felt different, not in appearance, in relation. Because for the first time, the systems he had relied upon to structure outcomes were no longer responding to him. They were responding to something else, something already aligned, something already complete. That evening, Iliana stood by the window of her apartment, the city unfolding beneath her in quiet layers of light and motion. Her notebook lay open on the desk behind her. A single line had been added, proceedings initiated. She did not write anything more, because what mattered was no longer what could be observed. It was what would continue, inevitably, methodically, until the structure reached its conclusion. And Iliana, as always, did not need to witness it. She had already ensured that it would happen. Loss, when it finally becomes visible, rarely announces itself in a single moment. It accumulates quietly at first, through small fractures in structure, through shifts so subtle they can be dismissed, until the system that once appeared stable begins to reveal its instability in ways that can no longer be contained. For Silas Caldwell, it did not begin with the hearing. It began in the days that followed. The requests increased, not dramatically, but consistently. Additional documentation, expanded timelines, clarifications that required more than surface responses. Each inquiry carried the same tone, measured, procedural, devoid of accusation. But beneath that tone, there was a direction that had become impossible to ignore. The system was no longer asking whether something had happened. It was determining how it had happened, and who had known. Silas responded as he always had, precisely, strategically, maintaining a level of composure that had served him well throughout his career. His office remained organized, his communications controlled, his language carefully aligned with legal boundaries that he understood intimately. But control, he began to realize, was no longer defined by how well he managed his responses. It was defined by what had already been established beyond them. At Caldwell and Pierce, the atmosphere shifted in ways that were not immediately visible to those outside the firm, but unmistakable to those within it. Meetings became more frequent, not to plan growth, to manage exposure. Conversations that once centered on expansion now revolved around containment. How to respond, what to disclose, which clients required reassurance, which required distance. Daniel Pierce's office remained closed more often than not. When he did emerge, his movements were sharper, his interactions more controlled, as though each decision carried a weight that had not existed before. Silas noticed. He did not comment, because to acknowledge the shift would require naming it, and naming it would require admitting that something had already moved beyond their control. The first external consequence arrived quietly. A client withdrew, not abruptly, not publicly. A message, brief, formal, citing internal reassessment and timing considerations. The language was familiar. It mirrored the tone Silas himself had used countless times when disengaging from a situation that no longer aligned with his interests. Now it was being used on him. He read the message once, then set it aside. One client did not define the firm, but patterns did. And within days, the pattern began to form. Another delay. Another hesitation, requests for additional assurances that had never been required before. Each one small, each one manageable. But together they altered the rhythm. And rhythm, Silas understood, was what sustained momentum. Without it, structure faltered. The formal notice arrived at the end of the week. Not from a client, from a governing body. The language was again precise, stripped of anything unnecessary. Pending review. Temporary suspension of certain activities. Cooperation required. There was no accusation stated directly, but the implication was clear. The firm was no longer operating without scrutiny. Silas read the notice in his office, the door closed, the city beyond the glass now irrelevant. He did not sit. He remained standing, the document in his hand, his posture unchanged. But internally something shifted, not in panic, in recognition. Because this was no longer about managing a situation. This was about responding to a structure that had already been defined. He thought briefly of the timeline, not of the transactions, of the sequence, the inquiry, the hearing, the escalation, each step aligned, not randomly, deliberately. And within that alignment there was a question he had not yet allowed himself to fully consider. Who had provided the structure? Because the system had not discovered this on its own. It had been guided, informed, given direction. Silas moved to his desk and opened a drawer, not searching but confirming. The documents he had reviewed weeks earlier were still there, undisturbed, as they should be. Nothing missing, nothing out of place, which meant the realization did not arrive as a shock. It arrived as a quiet convergence of details he had previously dismissed. Iliana, her silence, her lack of resistance, the absence of negotiation, the way she had signed the documents without question. At the time, he had interpreted it as acceptance. Now, he reconsidered, not emotionally, structurally, because Iliana had never reacted in ways that required interpretation. She had observed, and observation, when combined with time, became understanding. Silas closed the drawer. Slowly. The apartment felt different now, not because anything had changed within it, but because his understanding of it had shifted. Every conversation, every dismissal, every assumption he had made about her reframed, not as background, as presence, quiet, consistent, unseen, until it was no longer necessary to remain unseen. Across the city, Iliana did not revisit those moments. She did not reconstruct conversations or reinterpret past behavior, because for her, the past had never required revision. It had always been recorded accurately. What changed was not her understanding of it, but its position within a larger structure. Silas's professional standing deteriorated in increments. The firm's internal review expanded. External pressure increased. Opportunities that had once appeared within reach began to withdraw, not dramatically, but with a consistency that left no room for misinterpretation. A meeting canceled. A call not returned. A proposal delayed indefinitely. Each one, a small adjustment. Each one, contributing to a larger shift, until the position he had occupied, confident, forward-moving, defined by control, began to erode. Not visibly at first, but undeniably. The notice regarding his license arrived 2 weeks later. Formal, direct, pending investigation. His ability to practice would be suspended, temporary, but indefinite. Silas read it in silence, then placed it on his desk. There was no immediate reaction, no outward sign of disruption, because by the time the notice arrived, the outcome had already begun to take shape. This was not the beginning, it was continuation. He thought again of the conference room, the signing, the way he had spoken, the words he had chosen not carelessly but with a certainty that had felt justified at the time. Penniless. The word returned now not as something he had said, but as something that revealed more than he had intended, because Iliana had not responded. Not then, not later. She had simply proceeded. And in proceeding, she had done something Silas had not accounted for. She had removed herself from his structure. While understanding it completely, Iliana, meanwhile, continued her work. Meetings, decisions, structures that required attention beyond anything that had existed before. Marchand Holdings did not pause. It evolved. And within that evolution, Iliana moved with the same precision she had always maintained. No announcements, no declarations, only decisions. Made quietly, executed fully. One evening, as the city settled into its usual rhythm of light and distance, Iliana stood near the window of her office, not her apartment, but one of the upper floors within the Marchand building. Below, her movement continued without awareness. Above, the skyline remained unchanged. She did not think of Silas, not because she had forgotten, but because there was nothing left to consider. The structure that had once connected them no longer existed. Not legally, not financially, not even conceptually. It had been replaced by something else, not by intention, by outcome. Across the city, in a space that now felt smaller than it had before, Silas sat alone. The documents on his desk remained where he had placed them. The silence around him was not unfamiliar, but its meaning had changed, because for the first time he understood something with clarity that required no further analysis. The system had not turned against him. It had simply continued, without him, and somewhere within that continuation, Iliana Marchand had never needed to speak. She had only needed to understand. Endings Iliana understood were rarely defined by a single moment. They revealed themselves gradually through absence, through silence, through the quiet realization that something which once required attention no longer occupied any space at all. By the time the investigation into Caldwell and Pierce reached its formal conclusion, Iliana did not follow its progress in detail. She did not read every report, did not track every procedural development, did not measure the outcome against expectation. Because expectation for her had never been the objective. Structure had, and the structure had already resolved itself. The final reports, when they arrived through Eleanor, were summarized, not simplified, but condensed into what mattered. Findings confirmed, violations established, professional consequences enacted. Silas Caldwell's name appeared within the documentation, not as a central figure of spectacle, but as a point within a larger system, one that had been examined, defined, and ultimately dismantled where necessary. There was no dramatic language, no emphasis, only conclusion. Iliana read the report once, then closed it. Not because it lacked significance, but because its significance no longer required her attention. Marchand Global Holdings continued, not as it had before, as something recalibrated. Under Iliana's direction, the structure shifted not through abrupt change but through refinement. Layers that once relied on opacity were adjusted toward clarity. Intermediary channels were reviewed, reduced, or eliminated where unnecessary. Compliance, once treated as a requirement, became an active framework, not to display integrity, to ensure stability. Daniel Reeves adapted quickly. Where his approach had once leaned toward preservation of existing systems, it now aligned with Iliana's preference for transparency, where structure allowed it. Maya Chen expanded her role. Audit processes became continuous rather than periodic. Reporting shifted from reactive to anticipatory. None of it was announced publicly. There were no statements, no declarations of change. Because for Iliana, visibility was not a tool for validation. It was a variable to be managed. One morning, several months after the initial transfer, Iliana sat in a conference room overlooking the city, a different room than the one where she had first been introduced, to the scale of what she now controlled, but similar in its restraint. A document lay before her, not complex, not layered. A single agreement, an acquisition, moderate in scale compared to the broader structure of Marchand Holdings, but significant in its implication. It represented not expansion for its own sake, but alignment, a strategic integration that reinforced the system she had been shaping. Daniel sat to her right, Maya to her left, Eleanor across from her. No one spoke immediately, not out of hesitation, out of recognition. Moments like this did not require commentary. They required decision. Iliana reviewed the document once more, not because she needed to, but because she always did. Terms, conditions, dependencies. All in order. She picked up the pen. For a brief moment her hand remained still, not in uncertainty but in awareness of continuity. The last time she had signed a document of consequence, it had been in a different room under a different structure with an outcome that had not yet revealed itself to anyone present. This time, the structure was hers, the outcome already understood. She signed, Iliana Marchand. The ink settled. No one reacted. There was no need. Daniel gathered the document. "It will be executed immediately," he said. Iliana nodded. The meeting concluded, not abruptly, simply complete. Later that afternoon, Iliana walked through the building alone, not because she needed distance from her team, because she valued perspective. The floors below moved with quiet efficiency, analysts reviewing data, legal teams coordinating across jurisdictions, operations continuing without disruption. Everything functioned, not perfectly, but consistently, and consistency, she knew, was the foundation of everything that followed. She stepped into the elevator and descended to the ground level. Outside, the city was, as it had always been, unaware, unchanging in its surface appearance, yet constantly shifting beneath. Iliana paused just beyond the entrance, not to reflect, to observe. People moved past her without recognition. Conversations overlapped. Time continued. Nothing about her presence altered any of it, and that more than anything aligned with her understanding. Power did not require acknowledgement. It required structure. Silas Caldwell no longer occupied a space within that structure. His name, once part of Iliana's records, no longer appeared in her current work. Not because it had been removed, but because it no longer connected to anything that required her attention. There had been no confrontation, no final exchange, no moment where past and present intersected for resolution. Because resolution in this case had not required interaction. It had required completion. And completion had already occurred. That evening, Iliana returned to her apartment. The space remained unchanged, minimal, precise, sufficient. She placed her bag on the desk and removed her notebook. It had grown thicker over time, not with unnecessary detail, but with accumulation entries that had once served as observation, later as analysis, and now simply as record. She opened to the final page. For a moment she did not write. Not because there was nothing to say, but because what remained did not require elaboration. Then, in the same precise handwriting that had filled every page before it, she wrote, "Structure established." She closed the notebook, not abruptly, not ceremonially, just closed. Night settled across the city, the lights arranging themselves into patterns that, from a distance, appeared constant, though Iliana knew they were anything but. From her window, the skyline held steady. Inside, the quiet remained. There was no sense of triumph, no reflection on what had been lost or gained, because Iliana had never approached any of it through that lens. What had mattered was understanding. What had followed was alignment. And what remained now was continuity. She turned away from the window. The room unchanged. The city unchanged. But the structure, entirely her own. In the end, nothing in Iliana Marchand's story demanded attention. There were no raised voices echoing through courtrooms, no public declarations marking victory or defeat, no final confrontation designed to settle what had already been resolved through quieter means. What unfolded instead was something far less visible and far more enduring. A sequence of decisions made without urgency, shaped not by reaction but by understanding. Because Iliana had never needed to prove anything, not to Silas, not to the people who once overlooked her, not even to the system she eventually came to control. She had only needed to see clearly, to recognize patterns where others saw fragments, to wait where others rushed, and to act only when action no longer risked uncertainty. In a world that often mistakes noise for strength, her silence had never been absence. It had been discipline, and discipline over time becomes structure. If you've stayed with this story until now, perhaps you understand something that isn't often said out loud. That power doesn't always arrive with force, and justice doesn't always require confrontation. Sometimes it unfolds quietly, exactly when it should. If this story resonated with you, feel free to share where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. It's always interesting to see how far these stories travel and who they reach. And if you believe in stories where strength doesn't need to be loud to be real, you can stay with this channel. There are more like this.